In August 1943, inside a dimly lit interrogation room in London, a high-ranking British intelligence officer sat across from a man who should have been his bitterest enemy. Clemens Schamong, the captain of the German submarine U-468, was a prisoner of war. His boat was gone, resting on the floor of the Atlantic, and most of his crew had perished in the icy waters off the coast of West Africa. Under normal circumstances, a captured U-boat commander would be tight-lipped, defiant, or perhaps hollowed out by the trauma of defeat. But Schamong did something that day that had never happened before and has never happened since. He didn't want to talk about naval codes or wolfpack tactics. He wanted to talk about the man who had destroyed him. Schamong looked at his captors and made an extraordinary demand. He insisted that the British government award its highest military honour, the Victoria Cross, to the pilot of the aircraft that had sunk his submarine. He told them that in all his years of warfare, he had never witnessed such a terrifying and sublime display of courage. He told them that if they did not honour this man, then the very concept of valour was meaningless. This is the story of Flight Officer Lloyd Trigg, a New Zealander who was given a brutal, split-second choice between an honourable survival and a legendary death. He had exactly 30 seconds to decide if he wanted to save himself or finish a mission that everyone else would have abandoned. And the only reason the world knows his name today is because the enemies who watched him die refused to let his sacrifice be forgotten. To understand the weight of Trigg's decision, you have to understand the sheer desperation of the Battle of the Atlantic in 1943. Winston Churchill would later admit that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever truly kept him awake at night. Hitler's Grey Wolves were not just ships. They were a collective noose around the neck of Great Britain. They were sinking merchant vessels faster than the Allies could replace them, threatening to starve the island nation into submission. Among these predators was U-468, a Type 7C submarine commanded by Clemens Schamong. She was a lethal, sophisticated machine, manned by a crew that had been trained to be invisible and merciless. Schamong was a career sailor, a man of discipline who viewed the ocean as his battlefield, and the Allied supply lines as his target. Thousands of miles away, at an airfield in Bathurst, West Africa, 29-year-old Lloyd Trigg was preparing for another grueling patrol. Trigg wasn't a hotshot fighter pilot chasing dogfights in the clouds. He flew the B-24 Liberator, a massive, 4-engine heavy bomber that pilots often called the flying Boxcar. It was a beast of a plane, ungainly, difficult to maneuver, and notoriously dangerous to land on water. If a B-24 hit the ocean, it didn't float, it shattered. Trigg and his crew of 7 were part of the thin line of defense protecting the convoys. Their job was to fly for 12 hours at a time over a featureless, grey expanse, searching for a single white ripple or the dark shadow of a hull. It was boring, exhausting work, punctuated by moments of extreme terror. On the morning of August 11th, 1943, Trigg's B-24, tail number S for sugar, thundered down the runway. The plane was heavy with fuel and loaded with depth charges, high explosive cylinders designed to crush a submarine's pressure hull. Trigg was a veteran, a man who knew his crew like brothers. They had flown thousands of miles together, surviving mechanical failures and the unpredictable tropical weather, but nothing could have prepared them for what was waiting 200 miles off the coast. As the sun climbed higher, the crew spotted a silhouette on the horizon. It was U-468, caught on the surface, recharging its batteries. Usually, a U-boat would crash dive the moment an aircraft was spotted, disappearing into the safety of the depths. But Schamong made a different choice that day. He stayed on the surface. He ordered his gunners to man the 20mm anti-aircraft cannons and the 37mm flak gun. He decided to fight it out. As Trigg tilted the massive Liberator into a low-level attack run, the Atlantic sky erupted. The U-boat became a volcano of tracer fire and steel. Trigg had to fly low, dangerously low, perhaps only 50 feet above the waves, to ensure his depth charges would hit the mark. He was flying straight into a wall of lead. At a distance of less than half a mile, the German gunners found their mark. A stream of 20mm shells ripped into the B-24's fuselage, puncturing the fuel tanks. In an instant, the flying Boxcar was transformed into a screaming inferno. Fire trailed behind the aircraft like a morbid cape, hundreds of feet long. Inside the cockpit, the heat must have been unbearable. The controls would have been scorching his hands, and the cabin was filling with acrid, black smoke. Every survival instinct Lloyd Trigg possessed told him to pull up, to bank away, to ditch the plane in the water, while he still had some semblance of control. If he ditched then, he and his 7 crewmen might have had a chance to escape the wreckage before it sank. But Trigg didn't turn. Through the flames, he saw the U-boat. He saw the gunners who were killing him. And he realized that if he pulled away now, the U-boat would survive to sink another convoy, to kill hundreds more sailors, to continue the war. In those final 30 seconds, Lloyd Trigg made a decision that moved him from the realm of soldiers into the realm of martyrs. He didn't just maintain his course. He steadied the burning plane, flying it with a precision that defied the laws of physics and the limits of human agony. On the deck of U-468, the German gunners did something unthinkable. They stopped firing. They stood by their cannons, frozen in a state of stunned silence. They watched as this living torch flew directly at them, refusing to fall, refusing to die until its work was done. They weren't looking at an enemy anymore. They were looking at a force of nature. Trigg roared over the U-boat at mast height. He released his depth charges with lethal accuracy. They bounced off the water and exploded around the submarine's hull with a force that lifted the vessel out of the water. Moments later, the B-24 hit the ocean. There was no graceful slide, no chance for the crew to scramble into life rafts. The aircraft, weakened by fire and moving at high speed, disintegrated on impact. Lloyd Trigg and his 7 men were gone in a heartbeat. But the story didn't end there. The depth charges had done their work. U-468 was mortally wounded. Within minutes, the submarine began to slide beneath the waves. Chamong and a handful of his men managed to jump overboard before the Atlantic swallowed their ship. As Chamong bobbed in the water, surrounded by the oil and debris of his command, he saw something floating toward him. It was a rubber life raft, one that had automatically released from the wreckage of Trigg's B-24. The very man who had just destroyed Chamong's ship had, in his final act of destruction, provided the only means of survival for his enemies. Chamong and his survivors climbed into the British raft. They sat there for 2 days, drifting in the vast ocean, saved by the equipment of the men they had just killed. When they were finally picked up by a British corvette, Chamong didn't keep the details of the battle to himself. He made sure every British officer he met knew exactly what Lloyd Trigg had done. He told them of the plane that refused to burn. He told them of the pilot who chose a mission over his own life. And because of the testimony of a Nazi captain, Lloyd Trigg was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. It remains the only time in the history of the award that the recommendation came entirely from the enemy. The most unsettling question in this story isn't how Lloyd Trigg died. It's why he didn't turn away. To understand the spirit of Lloyd Trigg, you have to look 12,000 miles away from the smoke of the Atlantic to the rugged, serene landscapes of New Zealand. In 1943, this was a nation of just 1.6 million people, mostly farmers, shearers, and tradesmen, living at what felt like the very edge of the world. When the British Empire called for help, New Zealand didn't just answer, they gave everything. Proportionally, this small island nation suffered one of the highest casualty rates of the entire war. From the mountains of Crete to the deserts of North Africa, Kiwis earned a reputation as stoic, immovable soldiers who possessed a quiet, understated brand of courage. They weren't looking for glory. They were simply there to do a job that needed doing. Lloyd Trigg was the embodiment of that spirit. Before the war, he wasn't a man of violence. He was a son of the soil from Huhora, in the far north of New Zealand, a man who understood the patience of the seasons and the value of hard work. But like thousands of his countrymen, he traded the tranquility of the farmhouse for the deafening roar of a B-24 Liberator's cockpit. The crew of Liberator S for Sugar was a microcosm of the Allied effort. They were young men from different corners of the Commonwealth, brought together by a shared mission and a cramped, noisy fuselage. There was Marine VG, Williams the co-pilot, Ivan Marinovich, the navigator, and the gunners and wireless operators who spent their hours straining their eyes against the glare of the Atlantic sun. In the close quarters of a B-24, you don't just work with your crew, you breathe with them. You learn the cadence of their voices over the intercom and the way they take their coffee. By August 1943, they weren't just a unit, they were a single organism. The aircraft they flew, the B-24 Liberator, was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was a temperamental one. While the famous B-17 Flying Fortress was known for its ability to take a beating and stay in the air, the Liberator was a different breed. It was faster and could carry more fuel, making it perfect for the vast distances of the Atlantic. But it was fragile. Its high-mounted Davis wing gave it great lift, but it also meant that if the plane had to ditch in the water, the fuselage would often snap like a dry twig. Pilots called it a death trap for water landings. Every time Trigg took off from the dusty runway in Bathurst, he knew that if an engine failed or a fire broke out over the ocean, the odds of a successful rescue were near zero. But in 1943, the air gap in the mid-Atlantic was the front line of the war. For years, there had been a massive stretch of ocean that Allied land-based planes simply couldn't reach, leaving convoys defenseless against German wolf packs. The B-24s flying out of West Africa were the solution to that problem. They were the long-range hunters tasked with closing that gap. Their mission was grueling. 12 to 14 hours of vibrating noise, freezing altitudes, and the constant smell of hydraulic fluid and salt air. Most patrols ended in nothing but empty horizons. But the crews knew that their mere presence forced the U-boats to stay submerged, slowing them down and saving countless lives on the merchant ships below. Meanwhile, aboard U-468, Captain Clemens Chamong was facing his own set of challenges. Life inside a Type 7C submarine was a claustrophobic hell. 50 men were crammed into a steel tube no wider than a city bus. There was no privacy, limited fresh water, and the constant, oppressive humidity that turned every surface slick with sweat and condensation. The air was a thick cocktail of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and the faint, metallic scent of the batteries. Chamong was a man who understood the psychological toll this took on his crew. He was their rock, the one who kept them sharp when the monotony of the hunt turned into the terror of being hunted. By the time their paths crossed on August 11th, U-468 had been at sea for weeks. They were operating in the waters off Dakar, searching for the heavy convoys that fueled the Allied war machine. Chamong was cautious, but he was also confident. His crew was well-trained, and his boat was equipped with the latest anti-aircraft weaponry. When the lookout shouted "aircraft" and pointed to the speck on the horizon that was Trigg's Liberator, Chamong didn't panic. He saw the distance. He saw the angle. He knew that if he dove now, he might be caught in the middle of a depth-charge attack while the boat was most vulnerable. Instead, he made a tactical decision that would seal all of their fates. He ordered the boat to remain on the surface and fight it out. He believed that his deck guns could shred the unarmored belly of the bomber before it could drop its payload. It was a gamble of steel against steel. As Trigg began his descent, the crew of the B-24 went through their combat checklists with a practiced, icy calm. They knew the risks of a low-level attack. To destroy a U-boat, you had to be accurate, and accuracy meant flying low enough to see the expressions on the faces of the enemy gunners. Trigg leveled the wings, his eyes locked on the grey shape of the submarine cutting through the blue water. The first bursts of German flak began to bloom in the air around them. On the deck of the U-468, Chamong watched through his binoculars as the massive bomber grew larger and larger, filling the sky. He saw the tracers from his own guns striking the fuselage of the B-24. He saw the smoke start to pour from one of the engines, followed almost instantly by a violent explosion of orange flame. At that moment, Chamong expected the plane to veer off. He expected the pilot to do what any rational human being would do: attempt to save his crew. If Trigg had turned away then, Chamong would have let him go, satisfied that the threat was neutralized. But Trigg didn't turn. The B-24 continued its path, a roaring, burning monument of defiance, flying straight into the heart of the German fire. Inside the cockpit, the situation was catastrophic. The fire was spreading rapidly, fed by the high-octane fuel and oxygen lines. The vibration from the damaged engines was threatening to shake the airframe apart, but Lloyd Trigg held the control column steady. He wasn't just flying a plane anymore. He was guiding a weapon. He had crossed a threshold where fear no longer existed, replaced by a singular, crystalline focus on the target ahead. The German gunners, hardened by years of war, found themselves hesitating. They were hitting the plane with everything they had. Shells were tearing through the wings, shattering the cockpit glass. But the bomber wouldn't fall. It was as if the pilot's will alone was keeping the wings level. This was the moment that would haunt Chamong for the rest of his life. He saw the sheer, terrifying beauty of a man who had accepted his death in exchange for the completion of his duty. Trigg cleared the conning tower by mere feet. The roar of the 4 Pratt & Whitney engines combined with the scream of the wind through the tattered fuselage created a sound like the end of the world. As the B-24 passed directly over the U-boat, the depth charges were released. They fell in a perfect, deadly sequence, straddling the hull of the submarine. The explosions that followed were massive. The water around U-468 erupted in geysers of white foam and black oil. The shockwaves buckled the submarine's pressure hull, snapping internal pipes and sending high-pressure seawater spraying into the engine room. Shamong's ship was dying. A few hundred yards away, Trigg's B-24 finally succumbed to the flames and the damage. It didn't glide into the water. It slammed into the surface with a violence that left no room for survivors. A massive pillar of water and debris rose where the plane had been. The Atlantic Ocean is a vast, indifferent graveyard, and for the 7 survivors of U-468, it was about to become their final resting place. Among them was Captain Clemens Shamong, bobbing in the swells, surrounded by the slick, black blood of his submarine. Out of a crew of nearly 50 men, only a handful remained. They were hundreds of miles from land, with no radio, no supplies, and the sun beginning to beat down on them with merciless intensity. But then, as if by a miracle of physics and fate, a bright yellow shape appeared among the whitecaps. It was a rubber life raft, an RAF-issue dinghy that had been housed in the fuselage of Lloyd Trigg's B-24. In the violent disintegration of the aircraft, the raft's automatic inflation mechanism had triggered, and it had bobbed to the surface, untouched by the flames. In a moment of profound irony, the German sailors scrambled into the very vessel designed to save the men they had just killed. For 2 days and 2 nights, Shamong and his men drifted. They sat in that small, rubber circle, staring at the empty horizon and the oily patches of water where the B-24 had gone down. There was little conversation. The shock of the battle and the sheer, impossible bravery they had witnessed seemed to have stripped away their desire for talk. Shamong, in particular, was haunted. He was a professional sailor who had seen combat across the globe, but he couldn't shake the image of that burning plane, steady as a rock, flying through a curtain of fire to finish its job. On the 3rd day, a British corvette, the HMS Clarkia, spotted the yellow raft. The Germans were pulled from the water, shivering and exhausted, and taken into custody as prisoners of war. To the British sailors, they were just more U-boat survivors to be processed. But Shamong had a different plan. He knew that under the rules of the Geneva Convention, he was only required to give his name, rank, and serial number. Instead, the moment he was brought before an intelligence officer at the base in Bathurst, he began to speak about the pilot. The British officers were skeptical at first. War is a business of propaganda and exaggeration, and here was a Nazi captain praising an Allied pilot with a fervour that seemed almost fanatical. They thought perhaps it was a trick or a psychological ploy. But Shamong was relentless. He provided every detail, the altitude of the attack, the accuracy of the depth charges, and most importantly, the fact that the plane was already a lost cause before it ever dropped its bombs. He described how his gunners had stopped firing out of sheer respect for a man who refused to die. The report moved up the chain of command, from the dusty offices in West Africa to the high-vaulted halls of the Air Ministry in London. The authorities were faced with a unique legal and military dilemma. The Victoria Cross, the highest honour the British Empire could bestow, had strict requirements. It required independent verification, usually from multiple witnesses on the recipient's own side. In the case of Lloyd Trigg, there were no witnesses on his side. Every single man on Liberator S for Sugar had died in the impact. Under normal circumstances, the story would have ended there. Lloyd Trigg would have been just another name on a memorial, another pilot lost at sea with no known grave. But the British military was so moved by the consistency and the passion of the German accounts, not just from Shamong, but from his surviving crew members who corroborated every word, that they decided to do something unprecedented. They opened an investigation based entirely on the testimony of the enemy. The Air Ministry cross-referenced Shamong's report with the flight logs and the known position of Trigg's patrol. Everything matched perfectly. The evidence was undeniable. Lloyd Trigg hadn't just completed his mission, he had done so in a way that had transcended the hatred of the war itself. On November 2nd, 1943, the London Gazette published the official citation. It read, in part, "The submarine was sunk, and the aircraft crashed into the sea with the loss of all hands. The speed, gallantry, and devotion to duty of this officer, who chose to continue his attack despite the certainty of his own death, were unsurpassed." King George VI posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross to Lloyd Trigg. It remains the only time in the history of the award that it was granted based on a recommendation and evidence provided by the enemy. But the story doesn't end with a medal in a velvet box. It ends with the human connection that survived long after the guns went silent. Years later, after the war had ended and the world had moved on, researchers and historians reached out to Clemens Shamong. He never changed his story. He never sought to diminish what Trigg had done. He lived the rest of his life with a deep, quiet respect for the man who had defeated him. In a world that often views war as a series of statistics and tactical maps, the story of Lloyd Trigg and Clemens Shamong stands as a stark, beautiful reminder of the human spirit. It tells us that even in the darkest, most violent moments of our history, there is a capacity for recognition, a moment where a soldier can look across the sights of a gun and see not a target, but a hero. Lloyd Trigg had every reason to save himself. He had a family waiting in New Zealand, a future that was 30 seconds away if he had only pulled back on the controls. Instead, he chose to become a living torch, a flash of fire in the African sky that burned for only a few moments, but whose light has lasted for over 80 years. He gave his life to sink a submarine, but in doing so, he won something far rarer: the eternal respect of the men he was sent to destroy. The Atlantic Ocean still holds the wreckage of U-468 and the remains of Liberator S for Sugar. They lie somewhere in the deep, silent darkness, no longer enemies, but part of the same iron history. And every time the story of the Victoria Cross is told, the name Lloyd Trigg is mentioned not just as a pilot who sank a boat, but as the pilot who was so brave, even his killers had to tell the world who he was. Lloyd Trigg's story is more than just a footnote in a military archive. It's a powerful testament to the heights of human bravery and the unexpected honor that can be found even in the darkest hours of war. It leaves us with one haunting, deeply personal question. If you were in that cockpit, with the flames closing in and the ocean offering a slim hope of survival, what choice would you have made in those final 30 seconds? Was the mission worth the ultimate price? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like these remind us that history isn't just about dates and maps. It's about the impossible choices made by ordinary people in extraordinary times. If you found Lloyd Trigg's sacrifice as moving as we did, please hit that like button. It helps us continue to bring these forgotten chapters of heroism to light. And if you want to join us as we dive deeper into the most incredible stories of the human spirit, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for spending time with us. We'll see you in the next deep dive into history.